of Daanish TV's English language TV channel, the voice of the Center for the Islam and Decoloniality. And today we have a very special guest, a very dear friend from South Africa. Actually, perhaps he may be our envoy to South Africa, Mr. Naeem Jeenah, and it may be a form of positive nepotism that we have someone with the last name Jinnah that we have on the show. But no, I'm just joking. But Naeem is the executive director of the Afro Middle East Center, one of the premier think tanks in my opinion, in the global south, and certainly one that analyzes the larger MENA region, Middle East and North America, and Middle East and North Africa, and I've also had the privilege of participating at AMEC, Afro Middle East Center, on discussing issues of Afghanistan and Pakistan as well. So they have covered an array of these topics. Besides that, the fantastic books and conferences they have put on. So it's really a pleasure to have someone of the intellectual stature of Naeem on the program, Naeem Bhai, as I will call him, and someone that also who has directed this institute, this think tank, which has put on some of the most amazing conferences, insightful reports, throughout the Middle East, in fact, throughout the world. I mean, so I strongly urge folks to check out maybe some of the conferences they've held, some of the books that they've published. One of the most recent one is an incredible book on it's on the topic of the making of the foreign policy of Hamas, and so it's a great pleasure and honor to have Naeem Jeenah, and I will call him affectionately Naeem Bhai throughout our program. So welcome, Naeem Bhai.
Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum, Junaid. And let me start by apologizing for mixing up the time zones. I really thought I'm coming on at 9 p.m. my time, which is in half an hour, rather than 8 p.m. So I was entertaining a visitor and, was in no hurry to get rid of her because I thought I had an hour left. So apologies for that. And secondly, of course, you have to call me Naeem Bhai because I can just imagine your father whacking you over your head if you didn't. So, yes.
That's a very good one. And just on a very personal note, I spoke about the conferences that Naeem Bhai and his Afro Middle East Center have organized. The last international conference, and much of our audiences did know my late father, Dr. Mumtaz Ahmed. The last international conference that he attended was the conference in Johannesburg, in Pretoria, and that was organized by Naeem Bhai on political Islam. Just as a side note. So,
if I can just say on that note, Junaid, that the collection of papers from that conference came out at the end of last year. Your father, of course, was supposed to have contributed a chapter, his paper that he presented, but soon after he went back, he fell ill. And so unfortunately, the book doesn't contain his paper. But that's our second last book that we've published.
The one on political Islam. That's right. I'm not going to say anything further about that because I could have potentially gotten that paper, but I was also running around the world, so I'm not going to say more because I'm a little bit culpable in that as well.
One of the only things I'll forgive you for.
Yeah. Okay. So. Naeem Bhai, I know that our time is always short on these programs, and we don't want to lose audiences that we've already lost, maybe some, and the rest of them if we go on and speak for hours and hours. So which is why I wanted to hone in on two themes, very different ones in that sense, but I think that it would give our viewership, not just our Pakistani viewership, our global viewership, a good introduction to who Naeem Jeenah is and what he has been involved in, and what has kind of defined you politically in terms of your faith affirming activism, your political roles, and in both within the anti-apartheid struggle as well as in contemporary times, one of the leading Palestine solidarity figures in the world, really, today. So, what the two topics that just for the audience, that we want to address, the two themes, broader themes, is one, of course, your own role in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, and particularly, I want to focus on the Muslim Youth Movement, the specific organization that you were involved in, and the second one, going to something different, and something obviously that you have an incredible expertise on, and of course the Afro Middle East Center deals with explicitly, and that is the contemporary Middle East and North Africa, and what kind of political assessment you have in terms of the regional dynamics at play today. So these are the broad two themes, and if we can begin our discussion. So I first want to just go back to Naeem Bai in the 1980s, and maybe a little context, but then maybe jumping right into kind of the Muslim youth movement. And let me just say before I let you address the question, is that we're obviously speaking about the struggle against the white minority rule of apartheid in South Africa, and we know that there are different tendencies in all of these anti-colonial, national liberation type of movements, and then within that, even within different, say, faith traditions, within them there are different tendencies as well. And so I want to and the reason I say that is because I want to kind of position what Naeem Bai was involved in, the Muslim youth movement, and kind of what was their ideological position within that overall framework. So Naeem Bai, please, start wherever you want.
Okay, so let me pick up where the last couple of sentences that you mentioned there, Junaid. That the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, of course, the anti-colonial and anti-apartheid struggle goes back, of course, almost 4 centuries, and from when the first colonialists arrived in South Africa, maybe more, around 4 centuries, yeah. And the first Muslims arrived in South Africa around the same time. So Muslims were brought to South Africa, the first Muslims were brought to South Africa as either political exiles or slaves by the Dutch at the time, from Dutch colonies in Java, Indonesia, Bengal, those places. And that was the beginning of Islam on the southern tip of Africa, in a sense. For a long time, if we consider that was the beginning of Islam in South Africa, you can understand that Islam and the Muslim community in South Africa began in a kind of crucible of resistance. Many of those ulama that were brought here, for example, from these countries, escaped from their slave masters, lived in the mountains around Cape Town, and taught and are buried in those mountains. There's a ring of graves of ulama around Cape Town in the mountains, for example. But for a long time, and I'm not going to give a long history, for a long time, until the mid-20th century, Muslim resistance in South Africa was largely around issues of Muslims. Not completely, but to a large extent. What I mean by that is that, it was a slave community, it was an exile community. They had to hold their own against the colonialists. Even as the community grew, in the Cape Colony, by the 18th century, about 30% of the population was Muslim, in what was a Cape Colony at the time. But they had to hold their own, and so, as I say, until the mid-20th century, Muslim resistance was largely around Muslim issues. So you had uprisings for example, against the plans to destroy a Muslim cemetery, those kinds of things. It was around the mid 20th century that from an Islamic perspective, individuals and organizations began to address the struggle and the resistance in South Africa as South Africans. So, of course, you had, for example, Dr. Abdul Rahman in the early 20th century, Muslim background, who was engaged in a number of organizations, trade unions and other organizations. You had the Unity Movement, etc., where a number of people from Muslim backgrounds were involved. But as, arguing that the resistance was on the basis of Islam, and that Islam had a message of liberation for all South Africans. That kind of phenomenon began in the mid 20th century. And one of the kind of well-known figures around that time is Imam Abdullah Haroon from Cape Town as well. Imam Haroon was the Imam of a masjid. He ran study groups. He did a lot of work in the African townships. The most oppressed people in South Africa were the Africans, of course, in the African townships around Cape Town, and was also involved in some way with the Pan-Africanist Congress. He was arrested and was killed in detention in 1969. Coincidentally, so he had a group in Cape Town, the Cape Muslim Youth Movement. Coincidentally, in 1969, the year that he died, was martyred, was also the year that the Muslim Students Association began in South Africa. A year later, in 1970, the Muslim Youth Movement. And I mentioned these two because these two became national organizations. The organizations that Imam Haroon founded and was part of were largely restricted to the Cape Town area. So it was a Muslim Students Association in 1969, the Muslim Youth Movement in 1970. And then you had two other organizations. I'll just mention them before talking more about the MOM. Two other organizations that formed later. One was in 1980, and this was an organization called Qibla, to a large extent inspired by the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And then a bit later, in 1983, as a breakaway from the Muslim Youth Movement and the Muslim Students Association, an organization which initially called itself Muslims Against Oppression, later calling itself Call of Islam. And so you had these three kind of tendencies, to use the word that you used, Junaid. One was the Muslim Youth Movement, Muslim Students Association, from the beginning kind of identifying themselves as what we would now call Islamist. Of course, that term wasn't used in those days. Then you had the Qibla movement, which in some ways affiliated itself or aligned itself to both the Pan-Africanist Congress and the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa. And then you had in 1983 the Call of Islam, which affiliated and aligned itself very strongly to what we called the Congress movement, basically the African National Congress, which is the ruling party in South Africa today. So there were these three tendencies. The Muslim Youth Movement, Muslim Students Association adopted a position towards the other liberation movements, which later in the mid-80s was given a name, and that name was, that label was positive neutrality. Our view was that we would not affiliate to any particular liberation tendency within South Africa, neither the Africanist tendency or the Congress tendency or the Black consciousness tendency, but that we were willing to, and we did, work with any or all of them at any particular points in time. So that was the MYM MSA kind of position. The other two organizations that I mentioned, Qibla and Call of Islam, of course, had their allegiances. The Muslim Youth Movement started in 1970, but for the first 7 years of its existence, wasn't really involved politically in the struggle in South Africa. Its kind of role was much more kind of religious, socio-cultural, da'wah, charity, collecting zakah, those kinds of things. part, in a sense, of the broader global Islamic revivalist movements at the time. It was in 1977, still, before my time, in 1977 that the Muslim youth movement then decided to get involved in the struggle in South Africa at a political level, in the anti-apartheid struggle. Grappled for a few years about what that meant, until probably became much clearer in 1980. 1980, many of the students who were part of the MYM and part of the Muslim Students Association, the MSA, many of these students got involved in the nationwide boycotts, school and university boycotts and protests, etc., that spanned across the whole year of 1980. And it was these students, in a sense, who were involved in the MYM, who dragged the MYM, not kicking and screaming, but nevertheless dragged the MYM into kind of political activity. And so the 1980s saw a heightened politicization and political activity of the MYM and its activists and the MSA. The two, had a very close relationship and alliance. So the MYM was very involved, for example, and the MSA in the protests in 1983 around the puppet tricameral parliament. Later, the decade of the 1980s was a decade of protests and uprisings that the organizations were involved in.
Right. And if I may ask you, Naeem, by some of the, broadly, some of the specific themes or the platform of the MYM, their agenda that they took up, of course, one, the principal main one being against the white minority rule of the apartheid regime, but some of the other specific emphases that the MYM placed within its overall ideological platform.
Sure. I mean, like any organization and like any movement, because the notion of movement implies some kind of dynamism, the MYM went through a number of phases. I mentioned kind of the one phase up to 1977, but even beyond that, went through a number of phases. And so, initially, our idea, while we fought against, as you say, white minority rule, against apartheid, our kind of ideal that we held as the Muslim youth movement was an ideal of an Islamic state. That we believed that we would overcome apartheid and establish in South Africa an Islamic state which will deliver justice for all its people, no matter what religion, no matter what so-called racial group, etc. This, for a good part of the 1980s, was how we understood our role. Qibla, the other organization that I mentioned, continued to hold to that position even beyond our first democratic elections in 1994. But for the MYM, that was the kind of position probably until around 1987, 88, 89, when we began to reevaluate what it meant to be a politically active Muslim. I would say in today's terms, to be an Islamist. Living in the kind of context that we did in South Africa. Now, let me say that, we are talking about the 1980s, when Muslim minority communities in the West, the notion of being politically involved wasn't something that was part of how they understood their role. The notion of being part of an evolving democracy wasn't something that they considered. I mean, in the US, you'd know, Junaid, even up to the mid 1990s or late 1990s, Muslims were debating about whether they should be voting in elections.
Right.
The Muslim youth movement, one of its activist leaders in 1995 at a constitutional assembly hearing said that we regard the South African Constitution as an Islamic constitution. It is a document that encompasses what we believe should be expected by Islam in a political society. This was in 1995. So, the notion of what political Islam means in a minority context, had lots of development in the South African crucible. You also had, for example, the Call of Islam, which never adhered to the idea of an Islamic State from 1983 when it was formed, and had other ideas about how we should live. Now, I must say that what this did to the Muslim youth movement and Islamic activists, political activists in general, is that there's always this, we use the term praxis, Junaid. There's always this interplay between theory and practice, that while your practice is influenced by your theory, that your theory also is influenced by how you live. And so our involvement in the struggle in South Africa also got us to reevaluate our ideas in terms of how Islam views issues around, for example, women's rights, the question of gender, the question of working with people of other faiths, interfaith activity, interfaith struggle, we might say, which for us in South Africa became a big thing by the mid 80s, that people of faith working together to overthrow an oppressive system. So all of this it was an interplay. It wasn't just how we understood Islam that played out in terms of how we conducted our struggle, but also how the struggle impacted on how we understood Islam. So the term gender jihad, for example, of course, we regarded our struggle in South Africa against apartheid as being jihad. We regarded people like Imam Harun, who I mentioned earlier on, my brother who was killed by the police in 1994, as, of course, shuhada. But we also regarded Steve Biko, the Black consciousness leader, or Ahmed Timol, an activist in the Communist Party. We also regard, or Neil Agate, a trade unionist who was killed in detention. We also regarded them as shuhada, because a shaheed was someone who died in the cause of struggling for justice. So the term gender jihad was a term that was coined in South Africa by someone who was the president of the Muslim Youth Movement, now Imam at a masjid in Cape Town, near Imam Harun's masjid, Rashid Omar, who coined the term gender jihad, because our struggle in South Africa is a jihad, but this is another jihad that we as Muslims should also be engaged in, this gender jihad. And so, that notion comes from this engagement of Islam with the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. And I think that this idea of how to live as I don't particularly like the term, but I'm going to use it, how to live as a Muslim minority, but still be engaged politically, still contribute to one's society politically, socially, economically, etc., and regard oneself as being part of the struggles of that society, as not as part of the struggles of that society, as integral to those struggles, and those struggles being integral to oneself. I think this is what kind of shaped the Islamic activists of that decade.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks for that, Naeem. And just two questions, and kind of interrelated, just emerged from that for me. You did say that from the very inception of and the formation of the MYM, you were not ashamed to say that we were Islamists. In a sense, that our politics, that we were inspired by Islam. And even going up until the late 1980s, it didn't seem like you disowned this term that we were Islamists. And so, related to that, I wanted to ask you, because, and this is obviously a very kind of a topical issue throughout that gets discussed ad nauseum. But I did want you, from that particular located experience of the South African liberation struggle, to, as a Muslim activist, part of a Muslim organization involved in political activism, the whole kind of dominant kind of pressures of contemporary of the contemporary world, not the pressures from the Western world and their quisling governments, Muslim governments in the Muslim world, about how this is an impossible, and your deen and your religion and so on should never mix with the kind of your politics and that type of thing, completely separate. And perhaps you shouldn't even be involved in politics, and that's even kind of another story. But just specifically on the issue of kind of this idea that why would you want to have that kind of your faith tradition, Islam in this case, be a part of kind of your political praxis? And is that in your view the correct thing to do, or not? And because as you know, many people, liberals will argue that this is, why are you combining these two things? You can just be a good political activist, and your Islam is something that you do at home in your private life. But clearly, this was not the case with many Muslims, including yourself. So just to speak to that, because this is a very dominant kind of a discussion in the Muslim world.
Well, firstly, let me say in the 70s and 80s and in the 60s, I mean, Imam Harun, for example, many Muslims also, even went as far as using the term kufr to talk about Muslims who were involved politically. Imam Harun, when he was martyred, it was difficult to find an imam that would perform his janazah salah to that extent. But the question you're asking, Junaid, look, there's no such thing as just a political activist. So a person who regards him or herself as that is just a liberal who thinks that he or she has a social conscience. Everyone is inspired by particular values, by particular ideologies, by particular ideals, etc. And some of those might be socialist ideals. Some of those might be what are anarchist ideals. For me and others, and by the way, I still regard myself as an Islamist as much as I also regard myself as a socialist. For many of us, we were inspired by Islam.
Committed to the gender jihad, the environmental jihad, and still considering yourself an Islamist.
Absolutely. And all of those jihads, my understanding that these are jihads, and my understanding of how they should be prosecuted, all come from my understanding of what Islam requires of me. I have a particular ideological perspective. And so, I might just add, Junaid, that, I know where your question is coming from. In the South African context, the people I work most closely with, in issues of social justice, etc., are people who regard themselves as socialists and not Muslim, and there's no dichotomy between that. We have similar notions of what we want out of justice. I remember once I was outside of South Africa and asked a question about Palestine solidarity. Why are you so involved in Palestine solidarity? And the person, got a shock. I said, firstly, because I'm Muslim, and not because of any notion about Masjid al-Aqsa, etc., because I'm a Muslim and Islam demands justice. Yes. And so I'm an Islamic activist. And secondly, because I'm a South African and I understand what apartheid means. Yes. And so this is it. My activism is inspired by a particular ideology, a particular set of values, and sometimes those set of values interact or coincide with values of people who hold other ideologies dear and are inspired by those.
And those comrades and friends of yours never found it awkward, found you to be an anomalous or this bizarre character that is coming from a faith tradition that feels strongly in and is involved in politics that is inspired by that faith tradition. That never really happened in South Africa, huh?
No, not in South Africa. No, not in South Africa. I remember having us hosting foreign delegations. Once a Palestinian delegation, and people spending hours, without us knowing, us South Africans knowing, people spending hours debating about how this guy who, in the middle of our meeting goes off to pray,
Yeah.
is such a close friend and comrade with this other guy who sits with us and drinks wine at
Yes.
another time. And for us, what is the issue? I mean, what is your question? And then a similar. This Palestinian group said to me the next day, we slept at 3 o'clock this morning debating who was more leftist, you or this other guy who, by the way, is a self-identified Marxist.
Right.
And I thought, well, that's a very interesting, interesting kind of
Right.
dilemma.
They might, without um, completely, I don't know, condemning my my country, but this is impossible within the Pakistani context, in which
I know.
there is an Islamophobic, secular, liberal intelligentsia and elites that there is absolutely very little space, if any, for faith-affirming political activists and so on. And so this is why, in some ways, I wanted you to spell this out, that how radically, dramatically different this experience was, and I think it offers lessons for not only
Not
the
not
Muslim
not
minority
was
context. Yeah,
not was, Junaid, continues to be. I mean, those of us that believe that
yes,
we are still involved in a struggle for justice in South Africa, these relationships and intersections still exist. I mean, I was in a meeting
yes,
this past Sunday, socially distanced meeting, of course, and where we were planning a number of actions, and one of the other people there was a Black consciousness activist who's now a Marxist. The other two were from the Communist Party, and I'm the Islamist. And
right,
we
right.
planned quite well together. But yes, I mean, in Pakistan, this might be a difficult thing to find um, in your garden.
Well, you came once. I don't know if you found anything like it, but I'm not sure. Well, no, you
Well,
probably came more than once, but you came once while I was here. Yeah, yeah.
yes, and you tried to impose that kind of an event. I remember it didn't go very well.
Right, right. Right. So this is our second now attempt, virtually, to impose this on this context. No, wonderful name, but I think that I think that folks, our viewership, got the gist of kind of your own involvement within the MYM, its own forms of in some ways political and theological. It's political theology really, and the praxis that emerges from it. So that is a incredible introduction. So thank you for that. Name by so the second theme now, if we can touch upon briefly, um, because it's also having tremendous ramifications, as you're probably well aware, on Pakistan as well. So many Pakistanis are also very much concerned about that. The contemporary developments taking place within the larger West Asian region, Middle East, and North Africa, with of course the Trump years being, I mean, just in terms of I mean, it's always been the case that, of course, the Zionist state has been able to trample on and further entrench their settler colonial apartheid system over the Palestinians. But during the Trump years, it went to such an extreme that you can't even describe it. And we can what we can expect now. You could perhaps help us think about that. But beyond that, the larger kind of developments that are incredibly disturbing with many of these Arab regimes in the Gulf and now even beyond, beginning to normalize relations. We did a number of shows actually when the pressure on Pakistan at its peak over the past couple of months actually was immense to begin the process of normalizing with Israel. And this became a very serious discussion here, precisely because of the some of the brotherly Muslim nations and Washington, etc., that were putting so much pressure. I think because they also know the value of having a country of Pakistan engage in that normalization process. So this has been an incredibly disturbing development as the situation in Palestine just seems to get worse and worse. The situation in Gaza, the humanitarian catastrophe, a political catastrophe, and so on. So I want to get your read of it. I mean, I've laid out some things that I can see from here and how we have tried our best, those of us involved in the Palestine solidarity movement within Pakistan, to put pressure on to resist this at all costs. And I will admit it's not the most difficult place to do that because, as one good friend who we invited on this said that Junaid, can you actually imagine an Israeli embassy in Islamabad? It may not be the most difficult place to resist it, but nevertheless, we acknowledge that the pressures from these incredibly wealthy countries that our elites believe that we are so dependent upon, which I don't buy that argument, but they believe that, and therefore they do feel the pressure and constraint. So anyways, these processes taking place. Perhaps the question of Iran also comes up here, and how particularly post the post-Syrian war situation, and now the American-Israeli ongoing threats against Iran. Of course, now we have a new administration. See whether they're going to return to the Iran nuclear accord, and so on. So I know I've put out a lot there, but Naeem, by wherever you want to start in kind of assessing what's going on, your expertise is for us more than enlightening. So,
Junaid, I expected a question, not an essay topic. Look, I think you correct on the kind of really extremely difficult position that the Palestinians currently find themselves in, and the upcoming election is not a break with that. It's actually a confirmation of that difficult situation that's happening, and part of that difficulty is the fact that there are moves afoot, not only within occupied Palestine, not only within the Israeli context, but also within the broader Arab context and the Muslim world, and globally, moves afoot to make the Palestinian struggle irrelevant. To make it just some other domestic matter that they must deal with internally, and that the rest of us have nothing to do with. This really is what all the normalization moves seek to accomplish, and the countries that have gotten themselves into this, whether you're talking about the recent recruits like the UAE. And Morocco, and through the UAE, Sudan, for example, Bahrain, Egypt from previously, whichever ones of these you're talking about, they know quite well that what this means is moving towards making the Palestinian struggle irrelevant and unimportant. And that really is what this normalization is about. The more the Palestinian struggle becomes unimportant and irrelevant and a domestic issue, the more there are openings for them to do business with Israel as and how they would like. And to extend that to be able to do business with the United States as and how they like. The fact that Pakistan is resisting this, I think, is necessary, of course, but I think that that it's admirable, and the fact that you don't have an Israeli embassy or a strong pro-Israeli lobby in Pakistan doesn't mean that Pakistan is not facing the kinds of pressures that many other states do. Look, you don't have an Israeli embassy in Khartoum, and you don't have a pro-Israeli lobby in Sudan. But Sudan has agreed to normalize relations because it's been under the American jackboot It's been on the American list of sponsors of terror, etc. And this was the deal. So there are all kinds of pressures that a country like Pakistan will and does face. And not all countries of the global south have the determination and the resources that, for example, Iran does. I mean, Iran has held out against the United States hegemony and US sanctions for the past 40 years, more than 42 years. I mean, literally has been under sanctions for 42 years and has not only held out, but, has its own technology and all of those kinds of things. I think that with the Biden presidency, just to move on to a separate topic that you also raised, the indications are that there will be a return to the JCPOA by the Americans and a lifting of sanctions, at least to the level that they were lifted under Obama, under Biden. And I think Biden has made a number of kind of noises around this issue. And one of the concrete things he's done is to appoint Robert Malley as his special envoy on Iran. Robert Malley, of course, was one of the most senior people in the American negotiating team when the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, was being negotiated. So he also has relations with or understandings with people like Javad Zarif, etc. So I think that is going to happen, and there will be some reversals on that. But there are, of course, attempts by, firstly, of course, Israel, but also other U.S. allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, UAE, for example, that don't want the Americans to simply return to the JCPOA, that want an American return to be premised on other kinds of pressure on Iran. For example, around its missile development, around its role in the region, etc. So it's not going to be a ride that's completely not bumpy, but ultimately, I think that we will see a return of the U.S. And if sanctions are lifted, I think that Iran, there could be lots of changes within Iran as well. I do think that if there are positive changes in Iran in terms of the economy and those kinds of things, that there's also a possibility that depending on which government is around at the time, and it's currently the Rouhani administration, that there's a possibility that there might be a greater appetite to allow greater kind of freedoms in Iran, etc., that might ultimately, be to the benefit of Iranians, not only from an economic perspective, but also social and political perspective. So I think that living under a regime of sanctions, where the political elite believes that it is under a 4-decade situation of war, if that changes to a situation where they don't believe any longer that they are in conditions of war, that could make a huge difference also internally for its population.
So Naeem, the one question that I would have here is that do you think that if under the Biden administration and generally the U.S. national security state, if it does decide that it's probably more sensible to engage in diplomacy with Iran, beginning with going back to the JCPOA and maybe further, do you think that it may be possible for certain divisions to take place and between the Israelis and the Americans, the Saudis and the Americans, and so on these particular questions, and that perhaps for once that, I mean, there have been some few examples before as well, but that the U.S. national security state would, in fact, do this on its own initiative with regard to Iran, etc., and defy, in fact, maybe the wishes of the Israelis and certainly the Saudis.
I think there's two sets of dynamics that we should be considering here. There are others, but two sets that we should focus on, Junaid. One is the relationship of these states that you mentioned with the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. And I think on that level, there's a very interesting dynamic at the moment. You have a president in the White House who is fully committed to the Israeli project, but who has a particular kind of dislike for the person who's heading that project at the moment, which is Benjamin Netanyahu. And I think that that's an interesting place, because while he wants to ensure that Israel is protected, and he wants to ensure that Israelis and the Israeli lobbies in the United States know that he wants to ensure that Israel is protected. At the same time, he doesn't want to be a wimp to Netanyahu, and doesn't want to be Trump number two as far as Netanyahu is concerned. So he's going to act in what he's able to present as being in American national interest. And getting back to the deal with Iran, I think would be in that interest, rather than acting in Israeli interest. Similarly, you have a situation where he is still committed to a relationship with Saudi Arabia, but he has a particular dislike for the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, which is Mohammed bin Salman. He's supposed to release today, I think, that report on the Khashoggi murder in Turkey, which Trump, of course, didn't want to release. So, making the point that Mohammed bin Salman is not going to get an easy ride under his tenure. So I think that that's one dynamic that we need to consider. So Israel, of course, will have lots of latitude in a whole range of things, but on some things it won't. He's not going to move the embassy away from Tel Aviv. Right. That's become quite clear. But he's not going to take that Trump so-called deal of the century any further either. Right? The other set of dynamics that I think we should be considering or focusing on is within the region itself. If this happens, and I'm pretty sure that it's going to, the U.S. returning to the Iran nuclear deal, the possibility of even more Iranian funds that have been frozen in the U.S. being released, the possibility that you get once again a queue of European companies wanting to go into Iran, etc., in some ways kind of strengthening the Iranian hand in the region. What are the dynamics then within the region? Certainly, I think that what you saw over the past few months, this kind of warming of relations between the Emiratis and Saudis and Bahrainis on the one hand and Israel on the other, I think those warming of relations will go to an even higher level, certainly in terms of intelligence, perhaps military, etc. And you'll get effectively, whether it's called that or not, that kind of a block being formed there. On the other hand, you have this other, not so much a block, but these alliances of convenience that have been happening over the past few years. So Iran and Turkey, for example, have a great relationship, but also have a great hostility. They disagree completely on Syria, but they agree on a whole range of other issues. Pakistan is somewhere in that mix as well. Consider the Kuala Lumpur Forum in December 2019, which Pakistan didn't attend, but really would have attended if it wasn't for that pressure. And so you have then these not necessarily blocks, but these kind of loose coalitions and alliances that I think would be very interesting, firstly, to watch, but also very interesting in terms of how they could redefine that whole region. And by region, I don't just mean West Asia or Middle East, but including South Asia. How that plays out in terms of, let's call it the Muslim world, I think would be interesting, because you would then have a situation where what Iran has been calling its axis of resistance could get redefined in a different kind of way. Not so much an axis of resistance, rather, to use a well-worn term, perhaps an axis that's not as aligned, a kind of non-aligned axis, aligned to itself. Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, etc., looking at their own interests rather than looking at the global interests and where they position themselves.
No, that's brilliant, and I'm glad that the second part, because I was going to ask you anyways, but you answered it, also the role of Turkey. And I agree with you that certainly the very tragic Syrian war that certainly the relations between Turkey and Iran deteriorated. But I think that beyond that, you're absolutely correct. There are many common, I think, goals and objectives of the countries. And yes, we all know why our prime minister was not able to attend the Kuala Lumpur summit, but it did represent, as you say, I mean, we don't want to call it a block, but it did represent clearly, and it is representing what is emerging. Certainly, a counter hegemonic force to what has been sort of the dominance of Saudi Arabia over large parts of the Islamic world, backed by, of course, the United States and Israel and so on. So I think that's a good place to leave on, and for our viewers and our particularly our Pakistani viewers to see what more positive possibilities lie in the types of decisions our leaders make in the future for our country, that may give this country and the other countries we've mentioned much greater sovereignty from the role of other nations and of course Western imperial powers. So Naeem Bhai, I really want to thank you for your time, and because you have such a great Pakistani tradition, both by in terms of your last name and by being late to the show. So you, we want to doubly thank you for these things. But no,
for
really,
making
thank you,
myself
Naeem Bhai.
Pakistani for
Really,
this hour.
yes, yeah. Thank you so much, Naeem Bhai, for being on the show with us today.
Shukriya.
Okay.